Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining the second of our series of IronNet Engage Talk, where we talk to two of our technical team members, Anthony Grenga and Peter Rydzynski. Hi, guys.
Hey, Oliver.
How's it going?
Great. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation. But before we get to that, let's start by talking about some of the resources that are attached to this webinar. So if you look down, there's a couple of things that you can click on if you're viewing this. There are the previous webinars that we've already done. So click on the channel, go check them out. There's a lot of interesting ones from really interesting thought leaders. And then you can also get a sense of some of the upcoming webinars. You know, we've got a really great one with the Forrester analyst on supply chain. A couple other ones from our EMEA team later this month as well. One of the other ones that I'd like to quickly talk about is our Iron Lens report that came out for August. It should be linked below in the webinar. And one of the great things that we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit about that today. So if you wanted to download that, follow along, you can do that as well. All right, so let's get started. So hey, great for you guys to join us. Let's start by talking a little bit about some of the things that we do here. IronNet as a company, we have an NDR solution in our Iron Defense. We have our Iron Dome collective defense capability, and for those who need it, we have a managed detection response capability with our SIOC. And so before we get started on some of the topics of the news, I just wanted to throw it to you, Anthony, to talk about. If you saw anything interesting this month, if there were any good detections that you wanted to share with the broader audience here.
Yes, of course. So we actually had something quite interesting just last week. A patch came out for a 0-day vulnerability in a WordPress file manager. So in the lag between the patch and what attackers were assuming was going to be the time that it took defenders to actually make that patch, we observed some attackers throwing that exploit at multiple WordPress sites. Actually, one of our customers was hit with an exploit attempt. Luckily, they did not have that plugin enabled, but we were able to pass over their payload to Peter and company on the Emerging Threat and Detection Research team, and they were able to discover that it was a C99 Mad Shell obfuscated slightly. So what the kind of interesting point about this discovery was the group associated was Donatello, and they actually do malvertising and monetization of access to put malicious ads on or fraudulent ads on site. This kind of ties into something IronNet has been doing specifically on the detect side, or what we call digital detect, where we will embed a pixel into advertising such that we could observe whether that advertisement is likely from a fraudulent or malicious impression. This kind of goes hand in hand with what that attacker was trying to do, and also ties into something that we saw from our digital detect data, where we observed a large number of impressions coming from WordPress sites with outdated plugins. So kind of a cool story overall, and we were excited to identify that. Additionally, some of the things we observed were Glooptaba malware, an exploit attempt, no C2 on that front. Some new phishing lures, including passport and gift card targeting, and some overall interesting insider activity, including attempted software cracking for some of them programs that users were trying to identify. So overall, a fun month.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I remember, earlier in the month, we'd mentioned that hey, things are looking pretty good for our customers. It sounds like, towards the end of the week, a lot of interesting things happen. So good for our customers, and great that you guys are able to do that to secure our customers, which is great. So let's start by talking about some things that we saw in the news last month. There seems to be a lot of interesting nation state activity. August, often for a lot of organizations is viewed as a slow month, right? You kind of get to the end of the summer, you want to take your final trips, your kids are about to go back to school, and so at least from an organizational perspective, right, things kind of slow down. But that's not really the case with nation states, right? Like they continue to press forward. And one of the things that it seems like you guys are looking at in the news is APT28 or Fancy Bear. So let me start with you, Anthony. Can you tell us a little bit about the threat that's going on, some of the activity that they're doing, and then maybe we'll throw it to Peter afterwards to provide some additional commentary.
Yeah, of course. So this was actually a joint publication by FBI and NSA, and they were, I guess, calling out the Russian hackers, like you mentioned, specifically APT28. They're usually associated with the GRU, or the Russian Intelligence Directorate. This publication that FBI and NSA put out calls out a new version or a new strain of malware that was previously undocumented. And they actually broke this down in incredible detail. And I'll leave some of the fun stuff to Peter, but specifically, this was kind of the full spectrum Linux piece of malware with a kernel module, standard C2 port forwarding, file transfer capabilities. And overall, it was just kind of fun to see the level of detail they took their investigation. The attribution was, quite funnily enough, was from an old IOC, specifically an IP previously utilized by Fancy Bear. But overall, there wasn't any details on where this piece of malware was observed or how prevalent it's been. So it was a little lacking in terms of those type of details, but in terms of the technical analysis, it was spot on and quite excellent. So I'll just punt it over to Peter because I know he loved this piece of malware and wants to talk about it further.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that again. This was definitely one of the more exciting samples that have come out in the recent months. But, I just want to foot stomp that last piece there, Anthony. It's always interesting to see malware that's so well documented. And I think it's funny because Risky Business probably said it best. They were like, this is probably more documented than the Russians even have it. So, maybe we've done them a favor, actually. But I kid. No, but to the technicals of this, I would say the more interesting pieces don't lie in the C2 and the modular aspect of this framework and its capabilities, but rather in its evasion techniques. Specifically in this case, as you mentioned, Anthony, this is a kernel level rootkit, so it's going to hide not only itself on target, but any of the actions that the malware takes on target. That's including files, network connections, all sorts of different things. So basically, it's invisible to the operating system, and so it's definitely critical that you're watching your network if you have a piece of malware like this in place. Additionally, obviously, given the fact that this is a kernel resident piece of malware, running secure boot would definitely be recommended in this case, but granted, that's not always possible given the lack of signing that many modules have, and in Linux systems especially. So but this particular sample was broken into, as Anthony, as you mentioned, into sort of 4 categories, 4 groupings here. You have your client implant, your kernel module to hide that implant activity, and then the server, and then an agent. Interestingly enough, typically we see, as analysts and as defenders, we see lots of information about the client and the implant. We see information about kernel modules and relays and things like that, but it's very rare for us to see such detailed information about the C2 server itself, so the backend server that actually receives bot communications. And that's largely due to the fact that, attackers have to put agents on target. We get the opportunity to then analyze those and find out how they behave, and that's typically where we stop. But in this case, it's very clear that somebody was able to access something they shouldn't have been able to access. I would say that the agents are likely not supposed to have been accessed, but the server obviously definitely was not supposed to be accessed. And so this is fairly groundbreaking for us to be able to see not just those inner workings of how the client side communications operate, but rather that back end server side as well. I think I'd leave you with like my little last note here, which I think the part that stood out to me most is again, going back to what you had mentioned there. This particular sample is not your normal sample. This is definitely something very rare to see. It's nice to see the United States government in collaboration in whole actually addressing this problem. This is incredibly insidious, very difficult to detect, not something you can necessarily implement safeguards against. So reports like this are critical to expose this type of activity.
That's really great. I'm sorry, Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. It just kind of some interesting thought I was having while you're talking, Peter, is it would be really interesting to see where they got this information, specifically because usually the government wants to put out this type of thing as fast as they can to let defenders know about it. And the level of detail was just something else. So
absolutely.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when I used to code, 20 years ago when I was a lot younger, that you always code, but nobody ever documents, and it's always like somebody else on the third party that comes in and looks at everything and tells you what's going on. Yep. But I guess like hackers or developers in some level too. Great. So that was really fascinating. So let's stay international for a second and talk about the second topic. which is on China, right? And talking about the Ios Sdk Kit that's making the rounds over the internet. So Anthony, why don't you start with that and tell us a little bit about the background of that topic, what you've seen, what you heard, and then we'll follow up with Peter on some of the details or color commentary that as much as you want to add.
Yeah, of course. So this is some interesting research done by Sdk, which is an application vulnerability discovery tool. They identified a Chinese ad network named Mintegral, and they accused them specifically of spying on user activity and also committing ad fraud and stealing some of the clicks that advertisers were utilizing their SDK. So the way this kind of works in general is Mintegral created an SDK that would facilitate advertising for monetization of certain services, and a vendor would expect to use this SDK to quickly put in an ad platform and then monetize some of the impressions they were receiving. And actually, Mintegral, accused by Sdk, is stealing some of those clicks and impressions and also harvesting data. So overall, it's kind of interesting, and it ties directly into the supply chain of software and the risk that exists there. A lot of times, people take it for granted that what you get from GitHub or the open source library that you utilize will provide the function that it says it will provide. And in this case, not so much. So overall, quite interesting.
And sort of unfortunately, along those lines, Anthony, with regard to digital supply chain, in this case, if you could have even performed some very basic evaluation of this particular SDK, trying to figure out whether it was doing things it shouldn't be doing, and the developers actually built in safeguards to prevent the application from behaving under doing its normal malicious activities if it was in an environment that it was being analyzed in. So any debuggers that are attached, if the phone was rooted, if a proxy was detected, any of these debugging and evaluation techniques are not effective due to evasion techniques that this SDK is employing, and that is, in my eyes, hard to say anything but malware. Not only are you doing something that you probably shouldn't be doing and is likely illegal, but furthermore, you are attempting to hide that activity too. And so, to me, that just screams malware. So, yeah, it just sort of highlights a very challenging issue with regard to digital supply chain, especially with the general trend of just sharing code and reusing code, and as you mentioned, Anthony, GitHub and all of this, and making things easier for developers. It actually ends up being quite challenging to secure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I'll date myself again. I mean, like in the past, we started to at least years ago when I coded, right? Like it was great to always get the little modules that allows you to do stuff to avoid writing hundreds of thousands of lines of code to do the same thing. And it's always interesting how that what's easy for folks to implement as a shortcut. Sometimes sometimes free is not free, right? Like there's a saying, if you don't know how they're making money, you're probably the product. And so it sounds like this is definitely one of those cases.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to highlight as well is sort of a secondary effect from this, which is, and I hadn't thought of this, but it was in the Sdk report. But they actually mentioned an interesting secondary effect of this type of fraud is actually that the Mintegral advertisement network itself was likely being prioritized over other networks due to its high performance metrics that it was getting through this fraud. So because it was, conducting fraud, it actually had really good statistics as far as user clicks and actual ad, redirection. And so it's easy to then guess that there has been a significant bias built into the system due to this fraud. And how you reverse something like that, I mean, a few ads lost is one thing, but reversing some deep bias like that in metrics and performance things is definitely an issue, and likely would see Mintegral kicked off entirely from advertisement platforms.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you can have, like, was it hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars market in the ad fraud space, and everybody just trusts a couple of these ad networks to do everything, and nobody really knows what goes on behind the scenes. It's something to keep an eye on. It's something that we do think about ourselves, and in terms of from a market perspective, right, detection, capabilities, and so definitely something to keep an eye on in the coming months. So let me switch gears a little bit and talk about, we've talked about two, nation state level, or at least international type of story. One of the things that we heard about a few years ago was Uber and the Uber hack, and it seems like there was some updates to that case from a couple of years ago. So let's start with you, Anthony. I mean, there was some development. Describe the development of what went on and sort of your thoughts around that.
Yeah, overall, in my position, this story gets a little scary as a security leader at a company, right? Understanding there's some ethics involved that likely would never even cross my mind, but overall, just interesting. So what happened was the security chief, Joe Sullivan, prior security chief of Uber, was actually charged with fraud for the specific incident and back in 2016 where the AWS creds were pulled from GitHub for Uber and they were able to hijack some user PII. In that specific case, Uber ended up paying them about $100,000 utilizing a bug bounty program, even though it was an offensive hack. Kind of an interesting way there. But it does add some interesting precedent for what security personnel will be liable for in times of crisis like this. So it's a fun tie-in to bug bounty programs, which we all know and love. So, Peter, what did you think?
Yeah, although this wasn't your typical sort of ransomware with your side effect of, ransom hostage, data hostage, this is still, in my eyes, a continuation of the United States and really the globe figuring out how we deal with the problem of ransomware, of attackers holding something hostage, whether that be the decryption of your data or actually the blackmailing you into payments due to the release of potentially embarrassing information. Regardless, this is the same issue, and this I think is a good step forward in dealing with this problem. We sometimes need an example, and I think this is a very good example. It's a shame to see this happen, and I'm sure that Joe Sullivan has a different angle to this story, so I don't want to necessarily throw him under the bus, but I do think that we needed an example of what you cannot do on the security side, and on the bug bounty, on the ransomware, on the hacker payment side, where you're not allowed to engage with them in that way, and then definitely not allowed to hide it. And this kind of puts teeth behind some of those things, and makes it clear to CISOs that you must disclose this type of information. You cannot hide it, and you cannot use a bug bounty program as a means to pay a ransom and try to hide it through that. So definitely some interesting details there. I think there's lots of stuff that Joe Sullivan probably wanted to maybe think about before doing, but I do think this is a good step forward in sort of our security landscape from the legal perspective.
Yeah, and I think there's two interesting points here. Is that as a security professional, bug bounty programs are awesome, and we need them to continue. But as Peter mentioned, the utilization in this sneaky way and covering it up is not a great thing for us. Additionally, we also never want to advocate for paying ransoms, as it just contributes to the behavior. But in this situation, as it impacted myself and others, it is kind of a catch-22. It makes you think about what that really means, and was $100,000 worth the number of records. But overall, never pay the ransom. It will discourage the behavior.
Yeah, and furthermore, one thing that was mentioned, and it's difficult to really say what would happen, obviously, but one thing that was mentioned is if Uber had come directly to authorities, a similar attack by the same actors was carried out not long after Uber was breached. And so there's speculation that should Uber have come forward, it would have been possible at the very least for authorities to have tracked this down and prevented that subsequent attack. And so again, it's very difficult to say whether that would have happened or not, but at the end of the day, without going to the authorities, you've made certain that cannot be a possibility. So, it's definitely a tricky one, but I do think it needs to be reported regardless.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's always a fine balance in terms of moving fast and breaking things, and also complying with some of the things that you have to. I think it reminds me of some advice I got earlier in my career, which is, if you have to ask if it's legal, it's probably not. And so just think about it and then move forward from there. Anthony, you bring up a great point. Speaking about the behaviors of cyber criminals and nation states in terms of not paying ransom and not encouraging the behavior. There seems to be some activity over the last month, right, with North Korea attributed to them with regards to them generating cash in a novel way. So talk to us about that for a moment, and then we could talk about our second North Korea topic shortly afterwards.
Yeah. So Beagle Boys, the element of Lazarus group that has been known to try to utilize cybercrime to monetize their efforts to then fund their intelligence portion of North Korean cyber, always has some fun stories around it. They're one of the notorious or famous APTs out there, which is generally a bad thing. As a nation state, you don't really want to be known. You don't really want to have so much published on you that everyone recognizes your name and can talk about a previous thing you've done. But what this incident was, which is kind of cool, the Department of Treasury, FBI, Cybercom issued a report late August regarding some activity, specifically ATM cash out scheme to kind of, again, monetize their access. This specific attack targeted more than 30 countries. They were attempting to grab about $2 billion. I didn't see any confirmed numbers of what they were able to grab, but this kind of ties back into some activity Beagle Boys were a part of when they went after the SWIFT infrastructure and were able to steal $81 million from the Bank of Bangladesh. They did actually attempt during that same time frame. They did attempt to transfer $1 billion, but the Federal Reserve Bank of New York actually blocked that transaction and identified it as suspicious. So overall, North Korean cyber is always kind of more of mafioso cyber than nation state. So it's all fun and games.
You can say that again. Holy cow. I mean, the breadth of the attack surface here is kind of the surprise for me. This is typical MO for North Korea, but I would say the real surprise here is the fact that it targeted 30 countries. And, I would expect is largely successful. I mean, I even saw a reference of some financial institutions in the United States being whacked. So it's, surprising to see them sort of branch out from their typical stomping grounds. But it's also sort of a reminder to everybody in the financial space that, it's not just your typical people after money. You have nation states who are highly motivated and highly skilled going after your financial, transaction space. So I would say another surprise here is this, again, just highlights the shocking understanding of global financial institutions and our sort of financial networks and how they work, even from a country that doesn't have legitimate legal ability to operate in our financial space. They're still highly intelligent around this and very aware of how it functions. And then the last piece of information, or the last interesting piece I found on this was, the attack vector remains phishing as your primary access means, but they did reference watering hole attacks, which is something that I just always am interested in seeing. They're very difficult to, as an organization, defend against. And so, the North Koreans are one of the few groups that have really effectively used these particular types of attacks for, targeted operations. And so it's interesting to see that they've branched, not, anything recent, but they are continuing to branch away from just phishing and using other means to get into networks.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What's the saying, right? Necessity is the mother of all invention, right? And so,
Sure.
If you're in a small country that's financially embargoed, right, you have to get creative to get the funding that you need to do the things that you should or should not do. That's a different question, but at least it's a way to get money to, I suppose, to keep the lights on and pay the folks that they need to. Staying with North Korea, right? Like they obviously we just talked about some of the more cyber criminal-ish activity. They also are doing traditional nation state type activity, and it seems like there's some reports that they're targeting government contractors. Let me throw that to you, Anthony, just to kick us off, on what you know, and what have they been targeting and what they're doing.
Yes. So this specific campaign that you're referring to was Lazarus Group at Large, and again another government advisory. This one by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, and FBI, warning that North Korean hackers are now targeting government contractors. And this kind of goes into a lot of what was going on with COVID-19, remote work, and some of those contractors potentially losing their jobs. And they're targeting them with North Korean typical targeting using social and posing as recruiters, this time using maldocs, which is one of their favorite infection mechanisms. So Peter, I think there's more technical side to this that's a little fun if you want to talk through that.
Sure. I mean, I would say from the technical perspective, this is, again, highly common to see. But what I found interesting here was, this represents a unique and less seen objective that the North Koreans have, which is intelligence. And funny enough, they're largely not involved in intelligence theft. They'll definitely get in there and steal what they can. But as far as the greatest threats to national intelligence, I don't think that the North Koreans are the ones. They're really focused on that financial gain, as well as any political motivations. So we saw that with the Sony hack and others, where the North Koreans are ready to step in with cyber out of principle. But again, it's rare to see them operating in the intelligence space here, and clearly only targeting. I mean, I don't see any financial gain that they're going to get from targeting defense intelligence contractors through phishing scams like this. So it seems to be entirely isolated to just an intelligence operation, which is definitely interesting. Another interesting piece here was the size of the campaign as well. This has been something that we've seen buzz in the community about this happening before it even happened, which is another rare one. So there was buzz, earlier this year about a highly coordinated campaign from North Korea, a phishing campaign coming out. And I am fairly certain, although I haven't seen direct ties back to those, original references, I haven't seen direct ties back from this, but I would say this is probably a part of that campaign as well. So interesting to see that play out.
I think your point was really interesting there when you mentioned that you don't often see the North Koreans doing this type of thing, and it might not put them on the spectrum in terms of potential risk as a nation state. My counterpoint to that would be the North Koreans are so overt about what they do, and their campaigns are so large in size that they actually could potentially, if they cast a wide net and don't care that people see them going after the targets they might actually come across some reasonable intelligence and actually could be a big factor in that foreign intelligence game.
Just because you're not reported about doesn't mean you're not doing those things, right?
Correct.
That's funny. That's great. Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, and it looks like you guys are following a lot of interesting news, both in the broader community, right, as well as with our customers and some of the things that you've seen on a daily operational perspective. As we get close to the end of this particular webinar, I wanted to throw it back to you, Anthony, for a few final topics. Going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you've seen from our Iron Lens report. I think we covered a little bit, but if you had any other thoughts around there, and then finally, you had some great perspective, based on what you've seen so far on what might folks seek in the coming months from a trending perspective, from a threat landscape perspective.
Yeah, I'll start it off with what I like to call the roller coaster of trends in cybersecurity, and specifically at the start of COVID-19 back in February, with everyone moving to this different remote work kind of norm. We saw a lot of the old end-day vulnerabilities for Citrix VPN, Pulse Secure VPN be revisited, and a lot of attackers were utilizing them because they were working, and a whole bunch of folks were accessing those VPNs, so it was difficult to identify random connections from different IP spaces. What I'm assuming happened and hoping that happened is a lot of companies actually started patching those vulnerabilities, and we're starting to see that move from more of the server side exploitation back to the client side, which is also a difficult thing to defend against. When attackers start going after users, it's usually one of the biggest chinks in the armor for a security professional. So we're seeing increased phishing with different style of lures. And actually, we just talked about this, where they're even going after the desperation that COVID-19 has happened with, going after government contractors and their potential concern about their loss of job with recruiters and what have you. Tying back into that with mal spam and maldocs, and one thing that I always joke around with Peter is back in May, CISA actually published a document talking about the top 10 exploited vulnerabilities, and 5 of the 10 actually have to do with Office 365 and Microsoft Word. So, I mean, that's always funny to kind of see that maldocs always pop up. And we see that on our side, specifically with the type of personality we have with General Alexander. We see a lot of impersonation attempts at our company, specifically looking for information or potentially trying to send over documents. But the roller coaster will continue, and we might see that ebb and tide go back towards server side as a new vulnerability does happen to emerge. But for the coming months, I'm expecting to see a lot of client side exploitation, a revisitation of maldocs, and potentially some new phishing lures.
Yeah, that's great. We get like the monthly, hey, General Alexander sent this. It's usually some variation of, help, I'm in fill in the blank, please send something, right? Or please look at this document. And it's always, we always like, yeah, that's not them. Which is always kind of funny, but doesn't mean they can't try though. So I'm sure, our sales development reps have some templates. I'm sure hackers got some templates too, right? Just put some different names and see what sticks. Well, great. Hey, thank you guys for joining us. This was a really informative session. I thought that we had some really good conversations around a variety of topics. Definitely appreciate the time that you guys have put into both working with our customers on the detection side and also coming on this webinar to talk a lot about what you've seen and share with our audience here on the Bright Talk channel. So thank you both very much for all that you do. Cool. And so before we shut down this webinar, one last reminder: if you're curious on some of the topics that we've talked about, we have our Iron Lens below in the attachment section. There's a number of upcoming webinars that are coming up, both with some thought leaders here at IronNet, with the analyst community, with Forrester on supply chains, a lot of generally interesting people, for live webinars, as well as the archive of what we have talked about with the different guests that we've had on the show over the past 4 to 6 months. So thank you. Thanks everyone for joining, and we wish you a good day, and check us out next month.
Thanks, Oliver.
Bye, everybody.